Welcome to the Empathy Stories channel, where we bring you powerful tales of love, resilience, and the strength of the human spirit. Today's story is one of heartache, hope, and a mother's unyielding strength. It's a journey of love against all odds, and we invite you to stay with us as we witness this incredible journey together. It was an unusually quiet night at the Harris household when Emily first felt the pain. She had just settled on the couch, her small hands resting on her growing belly, as her husband, Jack, walked in with a tray of fresh fruit. The sweet aroma of the ripe strawberries and bananas filled the air, contrasting the heaviness she was feeling. Despite the growing anxiety of her fifth pregnancy, she appreciated Jack's concern. He always made sure she was well taken care of, even when their lives were already full with their 4 other children. The thought of welcoming another daughter, Ava, into their family had both thrilled and overwhelmed her. They had already picked out her name, a beautiful one full of hope, Ava, meaning life. They dreamed of bringing her home, folding her tiny clothes, and setting up her nursery. But tonight, everything changed. The pain started as a sharp cramp in her abdomen. It wasn't like the usual discomfort of pregnancy, and her heart began to race as she tried to steady herself. This felt different. With trembling hands, she nudged Jack awake, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong. We need to go to the hospital." Jack, ever the protector, jolted out of bed, his fear evident. He grabbed the hospital bag they had packed weeks earlier, and in a flurry of panic, they rushed out the door, their 4 children still half asleep, confused at the sudden departure. The rain poured heavily as they drove through the dark streets, the wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. Emily squeezed the armrest, her breath shallow with each wave of pain. "Please, God, not now," she whispered through clenched teeth. Jack, unable to keep the fear from his voice, reassured her. "We're almost there, Emily. Just hang on." But nothing could prepare them for what was to come. At the hospital, the harsh lights of the emergency room greeted them like a cold slap in the face. Nurses and doctors moved with practiced urgency as they wheeled Emily to the maternity ward. The sterile, clinical environment felt suffocating, and the monitors surrounding her began to beep with a rhythm that only heightened her fear. The words preterm labor and emergency delivery echoed in the room as the doctor quickly assessed her condition. Emily clutched Jack's hand, her mind racing, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. She wanted to cry out, to plead for this not to be happening, but the pain was too overwhelming. The moments felt like hours as the doctors worked quickly, urging Emily to push with all her strength. "Breathe, Emily. Breathe for me," the nurse said, her voice firm yet soothing. But Emily could barely catch her breath, each wave of pain stronger than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the room fell silent. There were no cries, no sound of a baby's first breath. Emily's heart dropped to her stomach as she strained to see her daughter. "Why isn't she crying?" she cried out in a panic, her voice rising with terror. The nurses quickly surrounded the baby, their movements swift but calculated. But Emily could not understand what was happening. She needed to know if Ava was okay. Jack stood beside her, his face drawn with fear, but he said nothing, unable to provide the comfort she so desperately needed. Minutes passed, minutes that felt like hours before the neonatal specialist arrived. His face was unreadable, his eyes focused on the tiny girl lying motionless in the bassinet. He pressed his stethoscope against Ava's chest, then shook his head. "No pulse, no respiratory effort," he said flatly, his voice cutting through the silence of the room. "Time of death, 3:22 a.m. Emily's world shattered. She shook her head violently, her body racked with sobs. "No, no, no. Check again. She can't be gone." Her cries were raw, uncontrollable, as she collapsed into Jack's arms. She could feel the weight of grief pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. How could this be happening? She had just carried her daughter for 27 weeks. How could she be gone so soon? The nurse, her face filled with sympathy, approached them gently. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said softly, but her words barely registered. Emily sat motionless, numb, as they wrapped Ava's tiny body in a soft white cloth. She could barely comprehend what was happening. Her baby, her precious daughter, was gone. Jack signed the death certificate with shaking hands, his eyes never leaving the page as the nurses wheeled Ava's body away. Emily was left alone in the cold, sterile room, her hands resting on her empty belly. How could this happen? She had carried Ava for so many weeks, loved her before even seeing her face. And now, in the span of just a few hours, she was gone. Jack sat beside her, his own tears barely contained as he held her. They both cried together, not speaking, just allowing the weight of the moment to settle over them like a heavy blanket. Hours passed in a blur, the grief too overwhelming to process. Emily's mind felt like a fog as she lay in the hospital bed, her body exhausted from labor and loss. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. Then, as if a whisper in her mind, she felt a pull. She needed to see her baby. The thought was persistent, urgent, and Emily couldn't ignore it. "I need to see her," she said, her voice hoarse, but filled with resolve. Jack, confused at first, nodded. "Okay," he said softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Okay, let's go." Together, they made their way to the morgue, guided by a nurse. The hospital halls seemed colder now, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering faintly as if mirroring Emily's own unease. She could feel the weight of the grief pressing against her chest, but there was a quiet resolve in her steps. She had to see Ava one last time. As they approached the morgue, Emily's brother Malcolm was waiting for them. His face was strained, his eyes red from crying. "Y'all ready for this?" he asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Emily nodded slowly, but her heart was heavy. How could anyone ever be ready for something like this? Her baby, her Ava, was behind that door, lying cold and still, wrapped in white cloth. The nurse swiped her badge, unlocking the door with a soft beep, and Emily's heart raced. The cold air hit them as the door opened, and the smell of antiseptic filled the room. The metallic clang of the storage drawer sent a chill down Emily's spine. She didn't belong here. Ava didn't belong here. The drawer the nurse stopped at seemed to loom before her like a cold, unyielding wall. The nurse glanced at Emily, giving her the option to open the drawer herself. With trembling hands, Emily reached for the cold metal handle. She couldn't make herself wait any longer. As the drawer slid open, Emily's breath caught in her throat. What she saw before her was too much to bear. It was Ava, wrapped in a tiny white cloth. Too small, too fragile, and far too still. Her heart pounded as Emily reached forward, trembling, afraid to touch, but needing to know if it was real. She gently lifted the cloth, revealing her daughter's face. Ava's cheeks were plump, her tiny lips slightly parted as though she had simply fallen asleep mid-sentence. "My baby," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe it. Ava was beautiful, too perfect. But she was cold, colder than Emily had imagined. Her skin so pale, so lifeless. And yet, there was something about her that didn't feel final. There was something she had to hold on to. Something told her this wasn't the end. In that moment, Emily wasn't sure what to believe. But as her fingers hovered over Ava's tiny face, her heart said, "Not yet." As Emily sat there, holding Ava's tiny body in her trembling hands, something inexplicable happened. The room, filled with the cold sterility of the morgue, seemed to fade into the background. Time, too, seemed to slow down as her eyes stayed locked on her daughter's face. The nurse and Malcolm stood quietly behind her, giving her space to grieve. But for Emily, grief was a shadow that could not yet consume her. She was still fighting, still holding on to the faintest glimmer of hope. It was then, as if the world had held its breath in anticipation, that she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Emily froze, her heart skipping a beat. She blinked, unsure if she had imagined it, her gaze shifting from Ava's face to the rest of the room. For a moment, everything felt still, and then it came again, a small, weak sound, a breath. Her heart raced. Could it be? Was she hearing things? She leaned closer, her face inches from Ava's still form, her hand pressing gently against the baby's chest. A faint rise and fall, a small movement, the tiniest of breaths. Emily gasped, her voice barely a whisper. No, no way. No, this can't be happening. Her hands shook as she pressed her fingers more firmly against Ava's chest, waiting for any sign, any movement that would confirm what she hoped for. Her mind raced with disbelief. And then, there it was again, another shallow breath, a flicker of life. Ava, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Ava, please. Baby girl, breathe for me. Malcolm and the nurse, who had been standing by in quiet support, moved closer. Their eyes widened as they saw the same thing Emily was witnessing, her daughter. The little girl they had believed lost was now showing signs of life. Emily, what's happening? Malcolm asked, his voice tight with disbelief, his eyes darting between Emily and the baby. The nurse, equally shocked, quickly moved into action. Get her to the NICU. Now, the nurse ordered, her voice urgent yet controlled. She could hardly believe her own words, but there was no mistaking it. Ava was alive. Emily felt a surge of hope wash over her. And with it, a flood of panic. This was no miracle, she told herself. It couldn't be. Her daughter had been declared dead. Her heart had stopped, and her body had been in the morgue for hours. But Ava was breathing now. Emily had no more words. She could only act. Malcolm moved quickly, lifting Ava's fragile body into his arms, cradling her close to his chest with a protective urgency. She's breathing. Emily, she's really breathing. His voice cracked with emotion, but there was no mistaking the excitement, the relief in his tone. Emily, still in disbelief, clutched Jack's arm as they followed Malcolm, their steps heavy with fear and anticipation. The alarms blared through the hospital halls as they made their way to the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU. The echoing sound of the emergency alert filling the sterile air. Every nurse and doctor they passed stopped to stare, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. Emily could hardly keep up, her legs weak from exhaustion and the overwhelming emotions coursing through her. Every step felt like a race against time. Every breath Ava took felt like a miracle. Hold on, baby girl. Please hold on, Emily whispered, her voice filled with raw emotion. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her again. When they reached the NICU, the doors opened, and the team of doctors and nurses rushed into action. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from shock to professional urgency. The nurses began to prepare Ava's tiny body for immediate medical intervention, checking her vital signs, adjusting the oxygen mask, and stabilizing her breathing. Emily watched, her heart in her throat, as they placed Ava on a heated table, surrounded by doctors who worked with practiced hands to keep her breathing steady. It felt like a dream. Emily barely dared to hope, but she couldn't help herself. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her daughter could survive. A doctor approached, his face hard with focus, but his eyes softening as he took in the situation. Her heart rate is steady, but it's low, he noted, glancing at the monitor. Her breathing is shallow. We need to keep her on oxygen for now and make sure her lungs are functioning properly. The team worked quickly, inserting a tube into Ava's tiny airway to help her breathe. The rhythmic beeping of the machines was like a constant reminder of how fragile life was. But in the quiet moments, Emily could hear Ava's faint breaths, each one a victory. The doctor's voice interrupted her thoughts. We've seen babies survive much worse, he said, trying to reassure her. But Emily was not fooled by the calmness in his tone. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes. She's a fighter, he continued, glancing over at Ava's tiny form. But it's going to be a long road. Emily nodded, her hand trembling as she reached for Ava's tiny hand. She's going to make it, she whispered fiercely. She's going to make it because I won't stop fighting for her. Jack stood silently beside her, his eyes locked on Ava's tiny form. He squeezed Emily's hand, his grip tight with emotion. His voice, when it came, was raw. She's still here. That's all that matters. We have time. Malcolm, standing at the foot of the incubator, wiped his tears. "She's a fighter. I told you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like her mama." But even as they spoke, Emily couldn't escape the fear that gnawed at her heart. Every beep, every change in the rhythm of the machines felt like a countdown. "Stable isn't enough," Emily whispered under her breath, her eyes never leaving her daughter. "I need her to be okay. I need her to be more than stable." As they all gathered around Ava's incubator, the uncertainty was palpable. But Emily refused to give up hope. She would be there for her daughter, no matter the odds, no matter how long it took. Ava had survived the impossible. And now, Emily would do everything in her power to ensure that her daughter's fight would not be in vain. "She's going to make it," Emily said again, this time with more conviction. "I won't leave her. Not now. Not ever." Days blurred together in the sterile, quiet halls of the NICU. Time seemed to stretch endlessly for Emily as she sat beside her daughter's incubator, her eyes never leaving Ava's tiny form. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was a constant companion, a reminder of how fragile this moment was. Ava's chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, each one a small triumph. Emily's heart ached with love, fear, and hope, all interwoven together in a tight knot that refused to loosen. The doctors had warned them repeatedly. Ava's road to recovery would be long, uncertain, and fraught with challenges. Her brain scans showed signs of oxygen deprivation, and the chances of developmental issues loomed over them like a dark cloud. But Emily didn't listen to the statistics. She couldn't. She wasn't prepared to accept that her daughter's future could be anything less than full of possibility. "I'm not going to lose her," Emily whispered softly, her hand pressed against the cold glass of the incubator. Her fingers traced gentle circles on the transparent surface, as if that could somehow connect her with Ava, make her feel close. "She's a fighter. She's already proven that." Every inch of Emily's body screamed for rest. She hadn't slept more than a few hours since Ava was born, her exhaustion deep and overwhelming. Her body ached from the constant tension, from the endless cycle of fear and hope. But she wouldn't leave Ava's side, not even for a second, not after everything they had been through. Ava had been declared dead, placed in the morgue, and then miraculously brought back to life. Emily would be here for every moment that followed, no matter how exhausting or painful. Jack, too, had become a shadow at her side. His eyes were dark with sleeplessness, his shoulders slumped with the weight of their shared grief. But his presence was a constant comfort. He didn't need to say anything for Emily to know he was just as committed as she was. His silence spoke volumes. And together, they supported each other in the quietest, most profound ways. Malcolm continued to visit, offering what little support he could. His face was always streaked with tears, but his resilience never wavered. He knew the weight Emily was carrying, the weight of a mother's love, the unrelenting desire to protect her child at all costs. He would never leave her alone in this fight. As the days passed, the small victories came, and with them, a flicker of hope that felt as fragile as Ava's life itself. Ava's breathing became more stable. Her oxygen levels improved, and slowly but surely, her tiny body began to regain some of the warmth it had lost. Still, there were moments of panic, times when the monitors would beep too loudly, or a nurse would rush in with urgent news. But each time, Emily held her breath and refused to let fear consume her. She had already lost Ava once. She wasn't about to lose her again. One afternoon, as the nurses adjusted Ava's oxygen mask, Emily leaned forward, her eyes locked on her daughter. The little girl's hand twitched, a faint movement that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by Emily. It was enough. It was a sign. Ava was still in there. She was still fighting. "Come on, baby girl," Emily whispered, tears filling her eyes. "You're not alone. You have me, and you have your dad. We're right here." Malcolm, who had been quietly pacing the room, paused and looked at Emily. His face was drawn, but his eyes softened as he nodded. "She's going to be okay. Eminencia. I know it. You're the strongest woman I know, And she's just like you. Emily smiled weakly, her fingers still tracing the glass, as if she could make Ava feel her presence through the barrier. I just want her to have a chance, she said softly. I want her to grow up. I want her to see the world. I want to hold her in my arms, not through this glass. As the hours passed, the doctors continued to monitor Ava's progress, adjusting her treatment as needed. Each day, there were small improvements, but the long-term outlook remained uncertain. Emily wouldn't allow herself to dwell on the worst-case scenario. She focused only on what she could control, being there for Ava, loving her, and fighting alongside her. It wasn't just about hope anymore. It was about action. Emily had spent her entire life fighting for the one she loved, and she wasn't about to stop now. With every step, every breath, every ounce of energy she had left, she fought for Ava. One night, after a long day of medical assessments, the doctor came in with a new update. His face was serious, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something resembling optimism. Her condition has stabilized, the doctor said, his voice carefully measured. There are still many hurdles to cross, but she's showing signs of improvement. It's too early to say what her long-term prognosis will be. But right now, we're just taking it day by day. Emily nodded, her hands pressed against the incubator, her chest tight with emotion. It wasn't the clean bill of health she had hoped for, but it was progress. And right now, that was enough. Jack stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. We're not giving up, Emmy said, his voice firm. We're going to take this one day at a time. Together. For the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to breathe. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, and there were still countless unknowns. But she also knew one thing with unwavering certainty. As long as Ava kept fighting, so would she. I'm right here, baby girl, Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. We're in this together. I'll never leave you. And as she sat there, watching her daughter breathe, each moment felt like a small victory. The journey was far from over, but Emily's strength, fueled by a mother's unyielding love, would carry them through whatever came next. In the battle for her daughter's life, Emily knew there would be setbacks, there would be pain, and there would be days when it felt like everything was slipping away. But there would also be triumphs, no matter how small. And through it all, her determination to protect Ava would never waver. She was a mother, and her love was a force no challenge could defeat. Thank you for watching and being part of this unforgettable journey. We hope this story touched your heart as much as it did ours. If you found inspiration in Emily's strength and her unbreakable bond with Ava, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that will move you. Stay strong, and we'll see you next time.